away.
Lovely, thank you, Hannah, and welcome everyone. It's great to be able to talk to you all about my favourite subject is doing historical research. And just while I share my screen so that I'm ready for the start of the PowerPoint, I'd just like to really introduce myself. I'm a freelance historian and heritage consultant, and I've been practicing freelance work for the last, 9 or 10 years. Prior to that, I worked for English Heritage as Blue Plaques historian. And prior to that, I started off in publishing as a research editor for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So I'm very much a public historian through and through, and have worked with a sequence of London-based heritage projects over the last decade, and shamelessly will be sharing images and anecdotes from those stories. Now, first of all, I should say I'm London-based, and I'm aware this is going to seem a very London-centric talk, and this is where you are going to really help us, because perhaps in the chat, perhaps in the questions at the end, you could just share where you're from, which buildings you're interested in, and maybe even what stage you're at, because that's one thing I really thought about, quite hard to judge. Much of this may be incredibly familiar to you, and some of it may be very new. So it'd be really nice to get your feedback in the chat or in the questions afterwards. So I think it is a case we're going to romp through half an hour of how to research your historic building, and I feel a complete charlatan in even attempting to do this in half an hour. But a lot of the slides, they are meant as reference slides, so they'll be shared as part of the recording. So please don't feel I'm going to be boring you by PowerPoint by death. And to keep us on our toes, we've got the watchful heron from who stands guard outside the National Archives in Kew. Any of you who've visited knows that he's a steely presence, and I think that's the kind of persona we need to adapt: skeptical, critical, and persistent. He waits for hours for his fish. So that's my analogy. So off we go with the presentation. Here's a quick run through of how we're going to structure it. I'll start off by saying why research your building and where to start, looking at which archives to explore and which sources to consult, a little bit on how to record your findings and write up your research, but I'm aware that's going to be very much dictated by what is the purpose of your research, and then questions at the end. And I thought I'd start with a building really close to me, a locally listed building at risk, 5 minutes walk from where I live in Barnet, in New Barnet, and it's a sports pavilion that's recently celebrated its 100th anniversary, and is a building I'm currently trying to find more about. And this is a key point I want to make: is you never get to the end of the research that you want to find out. There's always more questions to answer. There's always new archives to source. So this is very much from one historian to another. This is fellow advice. I'm not an authority here. Okay, off we go. So why research your building? Well, the most obvious question might be you need to answer when it was built. This is a nice interwar house in Hendon, 35 Crespigny Road. Incredibly ordinary looking, if I may say. There are thousands of houses around the country looking like this. But it's not so much about why it was built and who built it, but who lived in it. And this is a house that subsequently has had a blue plaque to it, to a secret agent. Who would guess that a secret agent with the code name Garbo would live in such an ordinary house? But that's the fascinating thing about historical research. It leads to wonderful discoveries and fascinating illuminations about the building, connecting person and place, really. So here's some of the reasons why you might research. Particularly for a heritage project, you might want to understand how it's been used in the past, understand its construction and fabric, which will then inform your schedule of repairs and conservation if that's what you're proposing. And it's always a good idea to actually create a chronology of all the changes that have taken place. Now, that's much more appropriate for a building of great longevity, such as a medieval palace or a shop, but it's also true of recent buildings. It's amazing how quickly the changes happen, even within, I'd say, a 100-year period, just to keep on top of how that use has changed. And one of the key things in all this is to understand and assess its significance as a building. And that's something I just want to dwell on a little bit, because some of you may have statements of significance to write or have written about the historic places that you're interested in. And for me, the absolute textbook for this is Conservational Principles, a brilliant guide that was published back in 2008. And this has obviously got great weight within planning, but also just our understanding of what a historic building is and how we value and cherish it. So it looks at 4 different values. It identifies 4 different values. Evidential, so what can it tell us about the past, this building? Historical value, how does it connect people to the past? It's aesthetics, so that maybe it's architectural merits, or it's interior decoration, or it's just beautiful setting within a green landscape. And then communal value, so the meanings of the place for the people who relate to it, who live by. And I really think it's important to have these 4 values when in your mind when you're doing the research, because it will help frame the more nitty-gritty questions as you go on. So where to start in a very physical sense? Well, make friends with your local history centre or your archive and your museum if you're fortunate enough to have one. They are the experts in your community. There is no way anything I can say in half an hour will match the knowledge and the information that they can provide you and the resources within the buildings. This is one of my favourites, Tower Hamlets Local History Library, where I had spent a good few days most recently. But before you go and you make your visit, please do take time to browse catalogues online and look at the online introductory guides. There are some horror stories out there about people finding out a reference in a footnote, making a trip to an archive and finding that perhaps that source has been destroyed by enemy action or by fire or flood. So please do send an inquiry before visiting in person, and always ask for advice. I cannot stress that enough. Not so that you're pestering an archivist, they're busy people, but genuinely ask for their advice because they will have that specialist knowledge. So here is just a selection of some of the published sources that you might already know, you might want to consult, and will certainly be lurking on the local history centre shelves. There's my favourite selection, but there are plenty others I can look at. And the 2 images I've shared with you, and apologies for the London-centric nature of the survey of London, but this is its survey of the Whitechapel area, where they created an amazing interactive map of the buildings. And even if you're not interested in Whitechapel, please do take a look at this fantastic resource, because it just shows what can be done, how you can blend documentary research with oral history, modern photographs and testimony. And then everyone is familiar with PevSner, Buildings of England. Again, I'm sounding very England-centric, but obviously the buildings of Scotland and Wales as well. And they are absolute starting point. Read the section. And if your building isn't in PevSner, do not worry. Many of my favourite buildings don't make it in, not even the streets. So it's making sure you've done the groundwork. So capitalise on local expertise apart from the people in the archives, working for the archives or the local history libraries. Join a local history society, go along to one of the lectures, get chatting about your building of interest, because there's so much knowledge that's not committed to print, even online. People have knowledge, or you need to go and speak to so-and-so. One step further is join a social media group, follow a particular local history group with sharing old photographs and memories. Facebook's particularly popular in that respect. And one of my treats, certainly in lockdown, is the House History Hour on Twitter every Thursday night, 7 to 8 o'clock. And it's brilliant. You learn from experts, they share their expertise, and there's the chance for chat, so you can follow on. And I cannot tell you how much I have learned from that source. And finally, there are many blogs you could follow and groups, but One Place Studies and Spitalfields Life are 2 of my favourites. I'm sure you have your own, and it would be nice to hear about them. So which archives to explore in person? And this is, again, quite London-centric, but London Metropolitan Archives For that, substitute your county record office or a city record office, wherever you live. In London, we have the great Bishopsgate Institute, which is also a fantastic resource, especially for the open shelves browsing ability. And then there are obviously the National Archives based in Kew with the amazing Discovery Catalogue, which links you to not just the holdings within the National Archives, but over 2,500 other archives around the country. So that's often my first port of call, even if I'm researching a case up in Shropshire or something like that. Look at that first, and then go to the specialist archive. Because we're talking about buildings, Historic England Archive is a bit of an unloved one, I often find. It has 1 million items selected online, but it can be searched online, but if you go in person, there are countless, thousands upon thousands of boxes that may be relevant. So do drop them a line if you want to find out what resources they have there. And finally, we've got the RIBA, the Architectural Collection, Study Collection. Now, online archives, there wasn't really room for everything I wanted to put on this slide, so I won't bore you by going through it line by line. Just to say some of the key things: National Library of Scotland maps for online looking at historical maps. It is second to none as an introduction. It really is fabulous. And then, obviously, if your building is listed or scheduled, you will want to consult the Heritage List for England or for Scotland or for Wales, which is online, which will give you a very good description of the building. And be aware that these listings are often updated with more information and possibly neighbouring buildings. So just have a browse. You can search by map or by location. And if you do make the pilgrimage to your local archive, you'll be able to source and access archives such as Ancestry, Find My Past, and the British Newspaper Archive for free there. Whereas if you're looking at from home, you'll need to take out a subscription. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that in the chat afterwards. So Ancestry may seem as an odd choice as it's a family history collection for somebody who's interested in researching historical buildings. But if you are mindful of what I was saying right at the start, to be able to tie in the people to the place, if you can identify a former resident, an owner, occupier, you might want to search, and that will yield a new line of inquiry, looking at personal records, family histories. But also it's possible, say in the selection of electoral archives that they have online, you might be able to browse the collection by place. And you'll see in this picture on the right, I've just done the drop-down menus for looking at Spitalfields, for instance. It does take quite a lot of trogging through to look at individual records, but it's worth having a browse through it, and you get a sense of what's possible and how it might inform the story of the building you're investigating. Now, the British Newspaper Archive is a phenomenal source. It is a subscription website, but I defy you not to get addicted. As it says, it's near on 50 million pages from historical newspapers ranging back to the early 18th century. And you can search, as I've put, by person, place, keyword, or by newspaper. And you will find nuggets of information about the past and the area looking in a way that seriously just hasn't been possible till all these wonderful archives were digitized. And I say that as somebody who spent 6 months of my doctorate looking at microfilm newspapers, and that was very, very toilsome. So it's a fabulous archive. Do have a browse, and if you're unable to subscribe to it yourself, make a trip to your local archive. And then for London, we have this wonderful London Picture Library, but a lot of hosted by the London Metropolitan Archives. But the same will be true of your local areas, whether it's a county record office or a city record office. They will have a photographic collection, and it's a great way to start building up views of the streetscape that's relevant to the building that you're interested in. Now, there are countless specialist online archives that I would suggest you may need to use during the course of your research, but this is one that has rightly been given a huge amount of prominence in recent years, and it goes from strength to strength. It's the Legacies of British Slavery, which is a remarkable research, public history research tool that enables you to look for the names of people involved in owning slaves. Unfortunately, these are the people who were compensated for the end of the slavery and were provided with a payout from the British government. Now, whatever the moral rights and wrongs of that, it is abhorrent to us now in the 21st century. It does mean that the records provide an extraordinary insight into who owned slaves and slavery plantations. And this image on the right from Project in Islington is a house which was lived in by the Lespinasse, Mr. and Mrs. Lespinasse in the 1820s and the 1830s. And we know from the Slavery Archive that they owned plantations in British Guiana. So it's a very sobering archive to consult, but I really recommend looking in for addresses. You can search by address, by the individual as well, and just seeing who perhaps the slave owners were in your locality. It is fascinating. Another specialist archive that again may seem quite far removed from building histories is the oral history collection, places such as the British Library, the Sounds collection. But I did just a very quick search when I was working on a project in Petticoat Lane and found that there was this extraordinary testimony by Dora Lee talking about her life in 1930s Petticoat Lane area and dealing with Oswald Mosley and the fascists on the street. Coming back to significance of place, this is really important to have oral testimony as well. So this is an attempt to fit as many relevant sources for building history on one slide. There will be more, and I won't attempt to try and summarize them, just to say the survivability of these records will depend on the locality you're looking at. For instance, parish rate books do survive well in some areas of London and not so well in others. So all of this is just starting points, and there's many more specialist things to look at. That's why you need to talk to your archivist, local archivist, and have a browse through those catalogues. So looking at a few of the more universal archives in a little bit more detail, here's a snapshot of a street directory, trade directory. This is the post office directory from 1902, and it just shows the kind of information you might find. So this is Wentworth Street, we're still in the Petticoat Lane area, and it sets out who lives on either side of the street. Be wary that it doesn't record everyone, but it records tradespeople as well as private residents. And it just begins to give you a sense of what was happening in that street 100 years ago. Census returns give you a much more granular view of what was happening in a particular house. This is the entry for 39 Wentworth Street in 1901. And I've just transcribed the key members of the household. One, Lazarus Skylinski, who was an immigrant from Russia, born in Russia, and you can see his wife was also born in Russia, and their eldest two children, but their subsequent children were born in Spitalfields. So it immediately tells you a story of when they moved to Spitalfields and that Jewish population that they sought out. So just gives you an idea of who they are. It includes servants and it includes professions, and as we go through the census, they become more and more informative, bringing it right up to 1921 with the current release of the census for that on Find My Past. Now, as you pull together all these different pieces of information, start comparing them, and this is just one example of how using an old photograph from 1974 of a shop in Petticoat Lane and contrasting it and just checking it against the telephone directories that you can find on Ancestry, and finding that S. Norden's textile shop was there, and and this is just the beginnings of piecing it together, and you might be able to create that chronology of how long S. Norden was trading at this particular address, 18 Wentworth Street. This is an example of a blue plaque case that I was fortunate enough to do for English Heritage, which just shows that I can go south of the River Thames and do some South London history. And it just gives you an insight, it's meant to give you an insight into some of the challenges of working out which house in the streetscape is the house in the records. This is a very fine Victorian villa from the 1860s where Ira Aldridge, the great Black American Shakespearean actor, was commemorated in 2007. But to actually pinpoint him at this address took a little bit of a sleuthing, I have to say. You wouldn't believe that a Shakespearean actor lived in Hamlet Road, but that's the road he picked out. Hard not to believe he chose it deliberately because of its name. And we can see under the list of residents in Hamlet Road, we've got our Aldridge Eye at Lurana Villa. Now, many houses did not have numbers until late 19th century, really. And how do we relate Lurana Villa to the modern streetscape? Well, a little bit of comparing historical maps. This is a map on the right from 1860. The area we're interested in, the southeast side of the road, which is as yet undeveloped. And then on the left, 1895. And it's the section of 7 houses on the bottom right-hand side. And I won't go into detail, but essentially I had to use the names and the residents and the names of the people living at the houses to work out which houses related to which numbers in the streetscape. Because the number one rule for blue plaques is you cannot afford to get the wrong house. So it does take some sleuthing, and I think it's all too easy to get very put off by the renumbering of streets and the renaming. This is why, again, I encourage you to talk to your local archivist, because they, as in the case with our Aldridge, managed to produce an additional historical map that I wasn't aware of, so to help me out. And this is another instance of connecting one building on the left. This is Richmond Avenue in Islington, which was built in the 1840s by William Warner Dennis, a local bricklayer and builder, with another building in the area, the Church of Holy Trinity in Cloudesley Square. Now, Dennis's wife, Mary Ann, his first wife, was actually one of the 170 odd burials in the crypt below the church. And it's a connection that hadn't been made, but it's putting the names you find in your archives and just casting your net further afield, looking at individual historical resources. In this case, it was a brilliant guide to Islington streets and finding, oh, right, so this is the builder. And these sphinxes adorning the houses in Richmond Avenue are some of the best known features in this sort of streetscapes of Islington. So it was really nice to connect a place in the street with a person and her burial. So it's always worth asking the blindingly obvious questions when we're doing research, because it depends on the kind of building you're looking at. But I mean, I've worked for investigated churches, for schools, and it is always worth asking, are there any archives still on the premises? The logbooks on the right were found within one of the school's many cupboards. When I started, it was my first heritage project as a freelancer, and it was just wonderful to find that they'd been kept safely. They'd not been chucked at, they'd not been skipped. And it's interesting, you may have heard about the restoration of Van Gogh's house in South London. Vincent van Gogh lived in Hackford Road. And the current owner, has done a really painstaking renovation of the building and found extraordinarily sketches by him under the floorboards. So this is as if you are running a heritage project and there is going to be investigation, you may find archives and material on site. Don't rule it out, and just be very mindful, telling your contractors, your builders, anyone involved, if you find anything, please put it to one side, even if it doesn't look significant. And then ask the community, does anyone have memories of living or working in the building? This is how we approached this school history project. The publicity below the postcard, just come and share your photographs and your memories. And I have found some good finds just by browsing auction sites and even eBay for postcards, images, anything, even deeds or letters related to the locality or person. Most times you don't get any hits, but sometimes you do. And finally, and I'm sure this is your first port of call, but make sure you've Googled or put the name and address of your building into a browser. Who knows who's written on it out there? You just don't know. So use every method available. Now, finally, really, we're going on to how to record your research. And this is something that I'm not going to go through, but it's essentially aimed at making a scrapbook, a digital scrapbook of everything you find. Key things I use is the snipping tool, which helps when you're browsing online sources and you just collate all this information. Make sure you add the sources, get into good habits early on, and add the sources to this this growing, bulging digital scrapbook. And just a few words, if you are visiting an archive in person, make sure you've got pencils and paper with you. Number of times I've seen people arrive and pull out a pen and a little bit disappointed that they're not allowed to use it. If you're new to archives, it's not intended as a sort of a barrier. It's just we have to be terribly mindful of these archives that need to be kept safely. And certainly use your phone or camera to photograph in the archives. Most will offer a small payment for a daily fee and will obviously advise you on how you might be able to use those photographs. They are for your private research. So if you want to share them more widely, you would have to seek permission. So this is just a slide to perhaps come back to as you do your research. And my final line here is don't expect to find everything you're looking for, and be prepared for sources to contradict each other. That's what is going to make you into a historian, is weighing the evidence. So these are just a couple of screenshots of the kind of scrapbooking that I have done. This is for a Petticoat Lane trail that Hannah and I worked together with on for earlier on in this year. You can see a sort of eclectic mixture of images from different sources, and here's more. And it was all to find out who this landlady was of a pub that's no longer present in the streetscape. It gives you an idea of just cut and paste, really. Now, here's my very earnest plea to say about permissions and reproduction of sources. I have sung the praises of these wonderful archives, and I always feel that it's what we need to do is to acknowledge their role, and it's a case of following their policies about how you can reuse digital copies of items that you've taken photographs of. So please ask again. Every archive will have a different form of agreement, and here's the one for the National Archives. Just please bear in mind before you excitedly share all your results, make sure you're doing it within the guidelines. And writing up the project, obviously this is going to depend on why you're doing the research, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this. And I thought I would share the most recent one I've completed, which is as a volunteer for the Barnet Society, and it's part of our campaign to prevent the demolition of a locally listed villa. This is an interior shot of its magnificent conservatory. And it went to planning appeal, and so my partner and I worked on compiling evidence to say why it is significant. And this consisted on these 5 appendices, and it's quite a good idea just to think about this sort of structure. As I say, you have to tailor your method according to your building and your particular needs, but that's how we approached it. And I'm pleased to say the planning inspector agreed with our evidence and the appeal was dismissed. Okay, well, it's been a bit of a run through. I hope I haven't completely overwhelmed you with information. It is just the tip of the iceberg. And I thought I would end with this image of one of my absolute heroes. You're supposed not to have heroes as a historian, but it's Robert Hunter, co-founder of the National Trust, who I was fortunate enough to research for the Blue Plaque Scheme. And he was not only one of the trio of visionaries who founded the trust, he was the lawyer who made sure that all the permissions were in place for to acquire land, and particularly with the fight to save the common lands in London. So he is somebody who believed in using history and using documents for the public good and for the public benefit. And I feel sure that's what we're all engaged on here. So thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your questions and taking part in the chat.
Thank you, Susan, for that run through. Does anyone have any particular questions for Susan on any particular sort of research techniques or any sources, anything to do about your own research projects that she might be able to help out on? Now is your chance. No?
Susan, just to start, I just wanted to extol the virtues of the British newspaper archive, because we were working on a case recently, the Tin Tabernacle up in Kilburn, and it had this vast narrative history and bits of information that had been passed down, but a massive lack of physical documentary evidence of the history of the building. And we did find a lot of lease information in the church's record office, but we were able to pinpoint who was using the church at different times, because it went through various different non-conformist churches by the adverts that were put out in local newspapers. So, from that, we could actually tell a story about the different churches, the different people, in a way that we just simply couldn't find in any other archival sources. And it was completely unexpected. But when we started getting into it, just this huge amount of information from really its beginning point to up to the mid-20th century emerged, and it was invaluable.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And it's interesting that a project that I worked on when working for English Heritage, which was a collaborative project on the Woolwich Rotunda, and my former colleague Emily Cole revised the report we did, and that was one of her lockdown projects, and was able to review it in the light of having access to the British Newspaper Archive, and could solve some key construction questions that we had not been able to solve through the traditional means, well, 12 years earlier, 13 years earlier. And I think that just shows that we have to move with the times and accept that there's constantly new archives, keep reappraising what you're doing in the light of the new archives that are coming online, which is, yes, the BNA is wonderful. Thank you.
Just to answer a few questions in the chat. Yes, Paula, I will send around the slides afterwards. And John's just made a point about being able to access documents about his house that was a Buckinghamshire house, but they were actually in the London Metropolitan Archive. So I suppose that's a comment about the fact that, quite often you need to double check in different areas if you're researching, because of shifting boundaries, or even just because things end up in different places.
Yes, that's so true. And that's really good that you've used the Some Alliance Insurance Company records. They are fantastic. And they really do relate to, the volumes are massive, and they relate to properties all over. And that's one of the things where I flagged up the Discovery catalogue as a starting point, because it searches not just the National Archives, but the London Metropolitan Archives and local sources. So it's one of my somewhat contrary pieces of advice is, when you start off putting a word into a search engine, start wide, don't start narrow in your term. Don't think, oh, it has to be in a certain location. Just try the name of the building, the address, the street name. You never know what you might find. And obviously, records are stashed all over the country that might be relevant. So that's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that, John.
The Water and Sewage Board.
Well, I think this is a little bit out of my comfort zone, but we've got the Metropolitan Board of Works in London, and I think there were local water boards as well. So definitely that's the kind of local sources that maybe in your local archives, the water and sewage. Even things like, I mentioned the rate books earlier, there were local taxes on all sorts to pay for all sorts of amenities, such as lighting, street lighting, paving commissions, and they list residents in that. So there would be no end to this presentation, but it is fantastic to see those. And the other thing I would say that is fairly special for researching house history in Britain, the Goad insurance plans, because they have
Yeah.
fantastic plans, as well as the actual insurance policies. So those are really invaluable.
They're the ones that are
I think-
like very brightly coloured because they're all.
yes,
Mm.
yeah, exactly. And to make a wonderful contrast to say Charles Booth's poverty maps, which you know, again, you can get into contrasting these different sources. They're always be mindful though of why these records are being made. I think, what are they seeking to do? Taxation records are just interested really who's liable for tax and how much they've paid and whether they've paid on time. And similarly, so just be sort of conscious that they might not answer the questions you're hoping. But yeah, it's a really good example. Thank you.
Susan, so can I ask another question? Because when we're working on buildings, we tend to do what you suggest and ask people to share memories or sources, but we tend to find it very difficult to reach people and to engage people in doing that, and it can be quite time consuming. Do you have any sort of advice on ways that, you know, as professionals or organizations, we can help to reach those communities who might be a bit sort of reluctant to engage in these kinds of projects?
That's a really good question, because I think it very much depends on the particular building and its place within that local community, whether it's a closed place of worship or something like that. So therefore the natural sort of community associated with it has moved away or is no longer resident. I think very often people are interested in, by simply opening up a building and having an open afternoon and a come and find out, no expectations that they need to take part. But I think most people's curiosity get the better of them, especially if it's a building that has been boarded up for a very long time, hasn't seemed to got, you know, future use, is one of those unloved. And people, if it's safe to open up and to bring people in, come and have a look around. And then I think it's a starting point for reminiscence. And, oh, you need to speak to so-and-so. I mean, that is the classic word of mouth, which I'm not sure how we categorize that as a source, but it is a brilliant way of finding who does know about it. For instance, yesterday I went to meet some residents, elderly residents in a part of London, and just talking about whether they'd be interested in taking part in a reminiscence project. And I was going to ask about a specific building and area, but actually listen and they will tell you about so much more. So I think it's being nuanced. Don't necessarily expect they're going to answer the questions you might have, but they will be the stepping stone. So that's a rather fuzzy answer, Rosie, but I think just welcoming people into the space is a huge step forward, really.
A question about, do banks still hold old deeds?
That is one I think is very much varied according to banks. I think in my knowledge, limited knowledge of this area, the more exclusive the bank, the more likely the deeds are still held onto. But I know plenty of people who try to get hold of deeds and they've just been junked. For instance, certainly with the introduction of the land registry, and as houses are bought and sold and added to the land registry, the deeds will be sent off, if you have them, to the land registry, and they will have copies. But I think this is a very grey area. I'm sure I can't be the only person who's gone around flea markets, antiques markets, and found loads of house deeds for sale. And that's why I do say something like eBay, you never know, it might be out there, you might be able to track it down. I found one recently that was relevant to a street local to me. Didn't particularly want to buy it, but it was quite nice to just get a sense of what it was like. So I'm sorry, that's not a categorical answer, but yeah, I think ask, but don't expect to find.
Thank you. Well, if there are any final questions, I can't believe we're almost on time. I don't think that ever happens. We will be sending, I will send around the presentations, and I might just ask you to answer a few little questions for some feedback. This is the first one of these how-to sessions that we're doing, so it would be really helpful if you sort of liked the format, and also it'd be really helpful to know if you've got any particular topics that you would like us to cover. going forward, whether related to research or anything else to do with projects related to buildings, historic buildings or heritage in general. That would be really good to know, because then we can tailor this training so it's as useful as possible to people. But anyway, thank you all for joining. It's been wonderful. I can't believe we've had so many of you. It's been really great. And hopefully you'll come along to some of the other sessions, but if you're not, do keep a lookout for further ones in the year. So there's 3 out at the moment that are coming over between May and June, but then there'll be subsequent ones in the year on different topics. So yeah, keep an eye out. But thank you all, and have a good day. Bye.